word for a meadow. And it was used by the early French explorers when they came out of the forest in the east and they saw this vast grassland in front of them. So it was natural that they used the French word prairie. So I asked, but Alain, is this what you would call a prairie, you know, what in France? Is it what you would think of as that? And he said, well, yes, there's, you know, all these wildflowers here, and there's no trees and grasses and things, but something's missing. And I said, what's that? And he said, cattle. And then it struck to me that when the first settlers, the first explorers came here, of course, there were cattle, there were bison, buffalo all over the place. So it was only natural that they used the word, the French word for prairie, for a meadow grazed by cattle. Now, prairie is a type of grassland, and grasslands occupied maybe 40% of the land surface of Earth originally, of the planet Earth originally. We have the Tallgrass Prairie, the Prairie Region in central North America, the Llanos in South America, the Caatinga Cerrados and sort of semi-tropical grasslands in South America, going into the Pampas, temperate grasslands in Argentina, Chile. The steppes of the savannas of Africa, largely grassland type of vegetation with widely scattered trees. The steppes of Central Asia, well, much of Australia is desert, but what isn't desert, I mean, there are forests there too, but there is extensive grasslands in Australia as well. A couple of these. This is a high altitude grassland in Kyrgyzstan in Central Asia, where I visited a couple of times. And this is in the state of Paraná in Brazil, sort of in between a tropical and a temperate grassland. And in this particular part of Paraná, they were actually cutting down coffee plantations to plant corn. And so you'll see corn in the background there, but this is a remnant of one of their grasslands that has been left behind. Now, the Prairie region is extensive. It's about 1,000 miles from east to west, from Indiana, say Indianapolis, all the way to Denver, and it's more than 2,000 miles from north to south in this. Now, this photograph is missing one part, and that's over here. There's a group of students that we went to on a agricultural tour to Ontario in Canada. And just opposite Detroit and Windsor, there is the Ojibwe Prairie, which is a tallgrass prairie. So they do occur in eastern Canada as well. But the point about this is that where Illinois is, this green area, we're in what's called the Prairie Peninsula. It's an area of grassland, a prairie that's surrounded by forest to the north and to the east and to the south. And so the reason you have this is, well, this is the Rocky Mountains here. And the Rocky Mountains come up, and if you watch a Weather Channel, you know most of the weather systems move from west to the east. And any rainfall that these systems have with them originally from the moisture, if it comes from the Pacific Ocean, it gets to the Rocky Mountains, and as it rises, it falls as precipitation to the west of the Rocky Mountains, as well as the coastal plains in California. And so just east of the Rocky Mountains, you have a dry area. And as you move farther east into the Prairie Peninsula, the moisture increases. So out here in the west, this brown and the orange area, this is the shortgrass prairie. And then as you move a little farther east, well, this is the shortgrass prairie, I'm sorry, the orange. Get to the brown part, that's the mid or midgrass prairie. And then the tall grass prairie is what we see here farther to the east. That area is called the rain shadow effect of the Rocky Mountains. Just a couple of pictures. This is a Pawnee grassland, extensive area east of Fort Collins in Colorado. And the Pawnee, the rainfall out there may be 10, 15 inches of rain a year. And the vegetation is correspondingly quite short because of the lack of more moisture. And this is used primarily as the rangelands that we think of as the West, like that. Then you get a little farther east, this happens to be the sandhills of Nebraska, but this is the mid or the mixed grass prairie. The rainfall might be 20, 25 inches of rain a year, something like that. And the vegetation is correspondingly taller, and most of this has been converted to wheat fields in that region. And then finally you get to where we are, the tall grass prairie, where the moisture is much more substantial, and the vegetation is much more luxurious as well. And this has largely been converted to corn and soybean fields. Now, there has not Prairie has not always been here. There has been Illinois, and the whole Prairie region has been greatly affected by glaciers over time. And Illinois has been affected by 4 different glaciers. The one that really counts most is what's called the Wisconsin glaciation. That's this area that you see in the green and the yellow there, the Wisconsin glaciation. And that started to melt maybe 15,000 years ago. The dates, I'm not a glaciologist or a geologist, so these days, it's like any field, current scientific literature is always changing stuff a little bit, but these are rough figures anyway. But the glacier started to melt somewhere around 15,000 years ago. And it was tundra, something you see in the far north, and the tundra was replaced by a spruce fir forest, a boreal forest, something you see today in northern Minnesota or Wisconsin, places like that. And that lasted a few thousand years as the global climate became warmer. And then we had a rich deciduous forest, something like you'd have in the Southern Appalachians today. Not all of the species, but something like what you see in the Southern Appalachians. And then about 8,000 years ago, the global climate became substantially warmer and hotter, and it was drier. And during this hot, dry period, it has been called the histothermal interval. I guess that's not used any longer, but anyway, it's a hot, dry period. And so the trees died out, the prairie vegetation moved in, and also concurrent with that was the landscape scale fires, because prairie is very much a fire adapted habitat. And you just had, 1,000 acres, 1,000 miles of grassland from Indianapolis to Denver, it's going to burn, and it would burn very regularly. So when the first European settlers came to Illinois in this region, this is what how much prairie and how much forest was found in roughly 1820. And yellow is prairie and green is forest. Forest primarily along the rivers and things like that, river banks and lakes, until you get to southern Illinois, which was unglaciated. And so like in Peoria County, it was about 47% prairie and 52% forest, which is a bit surprising at first, but of course you have the Illinois River with the forest along the Illinois River, as you see there like that. When we get to the farther east like that, where I live in Champaign County, it was 94% prairie, and I had the figures wrong, over 52% prairie and 47% forest. But anyway, over here, we had 97% prairie, 6% of forest, primarily along streams and creeks and things like that. It's interesting, as you go farther north, like Cook County was originally 86% prairie and 13% forest. You get up to Lake County, the next county north, you have the more northern affinity, so it's only 35% prairie and 64% forest. Now I'm going to talk about three different stresses rather, that affect the origin and the maintenance of prairie. And well, I should say I am a botanist, and so I am talking about the plants. And of course, you're more interested in the birds and things, but of course, the plants form the habitat for everyone. So I am concentrating on plants because that's my specialty. But anyway, there are three stresses I'm going to talk about with regard to the origin and the maintenance of prairie, and that's climate is one of them, is the first of them. This is the Royal Botanic Gardens in Kew, England, and here's Forest Park. That's your nature center there. And if we were in person, I would ask you to raise your hands. How many of you would think that you get more, which place gets more rainfall? That's the question I would ask. Which place gets more rainfall? Well, if you've been to England, it's intuitively, you think, well, it's always kind of moist and damp and things like that when you're in England. And we lived in England for a sabbatical period, and the weather was always brighter, showery weather tomorrow. It seemed to be the perpetual forecast. But since I asked the question, which gets more rainfall, Peoria or London, since I asked the question, you know that London's not the right answer. It's Peoria. On average, London gets about 28 inches of rain a year, Peoria 35 inches of rain a year. But it takes a lot more rainfall when you're with other climate conditions in Peoria than in England. First of all, drought. I mean, they do have droughts in England as well, but one feature of the climate here is that we have major droughts. And the last really, this was the same Prospect Cemetery Nature Preserve in Paxton, Ford County. This is a normal year, and this is a drought year in 1988. The plants weren't happy, but they were living and they were surviving like that. And so they managed to survive, and the next year they came back just fine. Another part about our climate is that we're in the middle of a continent, and many grasslands are in the middle of a continent. And we have periods, what was it, 88 degrees yesterday or something like that. We have these major shifts, not only from seasons, but within a week or two like that. We have major swings, but it gets really cold here in the winter and it gets really hot here in the summer. And both of those put major stresses on trees. This is a wonderful hill prairie in Greene County overlooking the Illinois River Valley. And this is our daughter, who has grown and has grown daughters of her own now. But she still remembers this day there. This was about 100 degrees. We parked down on the flat down here and hiked up onto this hill prairie. And it was hot, and she still remembers that. She did look around and she said, "My, this is really pretty up here, isn't it?" So she still remembers that. Another thing about the climate is that, well, when I was talking about drought, I should have mentioned, how many of you have read The Grapes of Wrath? Because that's all about the Okies and the major drought that happened in the 1930s. That kind of drought of that duration that lasted 5 years or so, those happen fairly regularly in our climate, going back and looking at the history. And every 100 years or so, it depends, of course, plus or minus 50 years, those kind of a major drought would happen. And one can only assume that might happen again as well. But during a period of drought, if you think this is a wonderful Robertson Hill Prairie Nature Preserve in Mason County, fabulous place. And during periods of drought, these trees would die back and the grasses would take over. This is coming up, the ravines or the draws here, or the forest in the back. And during a drought period, those trees would die and the prairie plants would move back in. And but during moist periods, the trees move out onto the prairie, and here are seedlings of oaks coming out onto the prairie from the forest in the back. But so I'm going to talk now then the second major stress of prairies. Think about what would happen to these trees here and there with fire. Prairie, as I mentioned, is very much a fire adapted habitat. We use fire to control our restorations, to help exotic species, but also just an integral part of the ecosystem, of the prairie ecosystem, is fire. And if you ever have a chance to do a night fire, it's even more thrilling than it is even during the daytime like this. But the prairie is very much a fire adapted habitat. Where I'm sitting, and I'm very fortunate in Champaign, the little strip of our subdivision actually has a rich prairie soil. I have a black prairie soil underneath us. And, but I'm sitting here, and every 5 years or so, this would have burned, because it happened very often, very frequently for the prairie fires, set either by lightning or by the Native Americans. But fire is beneficial to a prairie because it removes all of the above ground thatch, and it makes the spring blooming plants a nice, they don't have to fight their way through that old vegetation. Most prairie plants are herbaceous perennial plants, which make them nice to cultivate as well. They're herbaceous perennial plants. But also when the prairie burns like this, you have the ash that is adding nutrients, not nitrogen so much, but nutrients back into the prairie soil, so that after a burn, you just end up with this nice, flat, expansive land for the prairie plants to grow the next year. The third major stress in terms of plants of the prairie is browsing, because there are a lot of browsers like the bison, but also herbivorous insects, like the 100 species of grasshoppers in Illinois. But there's a lot of herbivory that goes on in a prairie, and this is beneficial. That keeps the ground, renews growth in the prairie as it's growing through the seasons like that. There's feces and urine that falls out of both insects and the bison, all the herbivorous, and that adds nitrogen and other nutrients back to the soil. So prairie plants have adapted to all three of these stresses because there's the soil line that you see right there like that. And prairie plants often have roots that go really deep, maybe 15 feet down into the soil. Not everything does. Here's a bird's foot violet, which has very shallow roots like that up there. But most prairie plants have really deep roots, like this compass plant here. And they go down. And so during a period of drought, they can draw moisture from deep into the soil back up into the surface of the growing plants above there. So during periods of when there's a fire, well, the fire goes across the top like this, but soil is a very good insulator. And these are herbaceous perennial plants. So the growing points are below ground like this. And the same is true of a browser, of a bison, or insects that eat the above ground parts like that. I don't know how to go back. There we go. That eat the above ground parts like this. The growing port, the meristems, are below ground. So if a fire, even in the middle of the summer or something, comes across and burns the top of the prairie, the growing points are below ground, or if they browse down to the ground, these plants will come back. Now, another thing is that many prairie plants are legumes. In the original native prairie, you have legumes like this one. And so legumes have these little nodules on them, little nodules on the roots. And those nodules contain bacteria that take atmospheric nitrogen and convert it into a form of fertilizer, the ammonia, that then plants can use. So prairie soil was originally very rich in fertilizer, in nitrogen, I should say, from legumes. And early farmers, and some farmers even today, will alternate crops where you will grow corn one year and then soybeans. And soybeans is a legume, it adds nitrogen to the soil. So the next year you don't have to use as much fertilizer when you grow the corn. Now, prairie is not uniform or monotonous. There are many different kinds of prairies, and I'm just going to mention some of these. With each category, there are different moisture classifications, but this is when people just say prairie, they think of a black soil prairie like this. This is Western Prairie. And there's a prairie, and here's the adjacent agricultural field with this beautiful, rich black prairie soil that's among the most agriculturally productive soil in the world. And normally when we see prairies like this, it's a black soil prairie, and it's also a moist prairie. We call it mesy. So this would be a good example of a mesy black soil prairie. But there are dry black soil prairies, and there are wet black soil prairies as well. But black soil is just one type of prairie. Another one is sand, and there are major sand deposits, especially in northwestern Illinois, like there's Savannah Army Depot, which is part of the Loess Mound area, now of extensive sand prairie that is up here and along all the sand prairies going out to Nachusa Grassland in Lee County here. A lot of sand left, much sand prairie is this little piece up there, but that's where a good bit of prairie remains today along Illinois Beach State Park, along Lake Michigan. And then there's outwash sand, which is along Kankakee and Will counties, right, and Kankakee and Iroquois County, I should say. And then all along the Illinois, at least parts along the Illinois River, including a little bit of sand. And I don't know if there's any sand prairie left today in northwestern Peoria County, but there's a lot of sand prairie left today in Mason County. And these are just some of the photographs of Illinois Beach State Park and Henry Allen Gleason Nature Preserve and Nachusa Grassland, which is some of you may have been to Nachusa Grassland, which is owned by the Nature Conservancy, and they have introduced bison into parts of this area as well. And there's a lot of natural sand prairie, and there are outcrops of sandstone here, and natural prairie as well as prairie restorations that have been done there. Then we have hill prairies. And hill prairies, you have hill prairies in Peoria County, Robinson Hill Prairie, and in Forest Park South. And so hill prairies are sort of islands of prairie surrounded by forest, and usually on southwest facing slopes where they are steep like this, and they face the southwest to get the maximum amount of afternoon sun. And so these were maybe used as lookout points by the Native Americans, and they burned them. Many of these have disappeared in the last 50 years in Illinois. This is Hanover Bluff Nature Preserve, and I'm actually standing in Loess Mound or Savannah Army Depot in the Sand Prairie, looking up at the Hanover Bluff Nature Preserve. And this is looking up at this right now with a former student from the U of I up there overlooking Hanover Bluff. I don't have time to tell the story, but I was up here one day. I had a very interesting encounter with a rattlesnake, shall we say? So, but that story is for another time. Something that's the idea of this is somewhat originated in Illinois. I mean, if you go out with a prairie enthusiast, you go to a place like this. This is Prospect Cemetery in Ford County, and you go to a place like this, which is along Route 66 south of White. This is a really beautiful, wonderful, really nice prairie. This is crap, or this is low diversity, low quality. Well, why do they call this one a good one and this one a bad prairie? Well, you can use plants to determine that. And one way is you simply compile a species list. You just count up all of the species that you see in a prairie like this, and you count up all the species that you see here. And the species that you see in Prospect is going to be much, much higher than what you would see over here. So this one might have 120 species of plants in it like that. Well, this one might have 15 or 20 or maybe 30 or something like that. So you just in sheer numbers like that, you can tell one from the other. But also the idea is that some species are better than others. And that's what I want to talk about next. And two people at the Morton Arboretum, Jerry Wilhelm and Floyd Swink, developed something called the coefficient of conservatism. And they noticed that some prairies are much nicer than others. And you go to a really crappy prairie, you're going to see a lot of the common milkweed there, and so they just divided a system that they use these coefficients of conservatism, which describes a species relevance degree of tolerance to human disturbances. And so this plant, common milkweed, is very tolerant of human disturbances like this. And so they call these coefficients of conservatism, or C values. They range from 0 to 10, and they only include native species. And these were assigned for the whole state of Illinois by a group of just a handful of botanists. And they're very subjective, and I might, well, this one I would call, maybe a 6 or a 7 or a 7, I might call it an 8, but that's okay. But the principle is still the same, like this. And so these, simply because something is a 0 or 1 doesn't mean it's not, they are native and they have a place. These are usually, well, I wanted to go back on here, sorry. I have another slide coming up in a minute about that. But anyway, so these that are 0s and 1s and 2s, like tall goldenrod or giant ragweed, they are native, but they're native to habitats that originally had some disturbance in them, like a buffalo wallow. When you have these bare soil and things like that, these plants are adapted to this disturbance regime like that. And so you do find them, just the fact that you can go to a high quality prairie and you will find these there, but the thing is you also find many other plants with higher coefficients of conservatism. And I'm going to go through a series of slides now, and I'm going to show you two different things about this. And through the seasons, we're going to go through the seasons, and I'm going to show you within a tallgrass prairie, you start off early in the spring with a group of species that come in, they flower and they set seed, and then they pretty much die back. And as you go through the season, then another group of species come in and they flower and set seed and die back. And then in the fall, taller species come in and they flower and set seed. So you have this whole progression of different species. That's why, like one prairie of 5 acres can have 120 species of plants in it, because different species occupy the same space over different periods of time. Now, this is Don Gardner's prairie, which is just magnificent in the spring with shooting star, and we call either wood betony or lousewort, the pedicularis. And these are the coefficient of conservatism of 6 or 7. But you can see there's also golden Alexanders in there, but they're low plants. They come up early in the spring and they flower. And they're only a foot or 2 high like that. Moving a little further along, well, there's still another cemetery prairie that has the in May. Prairie spring gets started kind of late in prairies, so usually in May, something like that, when in central Illinois, that prairies really get going like that. But you have the shooting star, which is 6, and prairie phlox, which is a 7, and you can see the prairie dock plants and other species that are coming up at the same time. Going along into June, is a time of the purple prairie clover and other prairie clovers, and the pale coneflower, which is the dominant coneflower that you find in prairies. And this is a 7 for the pale coneflower like this, middle of June, but the plants are getting taller. This is a quote from Herman Melville's Moby Dick. Go visit the prairies in June for scores and scores of miles. You wade knee deep among the tiger lilies. What is a one charm lacking? Water. There is not a drop of water there. Well, it is a music prairie, but you don't find a lot of standing water in most of these music prairies. But this is from chapter 1 of Moby Dick. And he evidently saw all of these lilies when he was taking a train ride from Chicago to Galena, Illinois in 1840. But this tiger lily, which was a Michigan lily, very likely has a coefficient of conservatism of 8. Now, the Peoria Audubon Society, you're looking that you have your own prairie. You have the Brimfield Prairie, and you have introduced this species into that prairie. You're trying to increase biodiversity. And this is a state endangered species, which is Queen of the Prairie, which is a 10. And it is in many prairie, well, it's a bit complicated because this is a state endangered species, and as such, it's restricted in how you can buy it legally. But nonetheless, I mean, you can buy it as a cultivar in a garden center, and specialty nurseries do make this available for sale as well. A little further along in the season, the prairie plants are getting higher and taller as the season goes by. Different species are coming in, such as a prairie coreopsis and wild bergamot, or big balm is coming in, and then the blazing stars start flowering in August, sometimes by the really thousands in a place like Ginsburg Markham in Cook County. And then in getting into August, you get the tall plants that are coming in, like compass plant and prairie dock. Compass plant is a 5. Prairie dock you see along roadsides and places like that, or in degraded prairie. So it is a coefficient of conservatism of 4. And then we're getting right now into the season of the sunflower aster family, like goldenrods, which are flowering, just beginning to flower right here, right now. And some of the different asters, sky blue aster or New England aster like this, are coming in. And the little sneezing cartoon is in there because people get the idea that goldenrod causes hay fever. Well, no, it cannot cause hay fever because it's an insect pollinated plant. It does not shed pollen to the wind. It's pollinated by all kinds of bees and insects that visit it. So it just happens to flower at the same time as giant ragweed. And giant ragweed does shed pollen to the wind, and that's what causes hay fever, but it's not the goldenrod that does that. And this is the sawtooth sunflower, which is only a 2, but you find it in all kinds of prairies. A low number doesn't mean you don't find it in a high quality prairie, but you find the higher numbers in a high quality prairie as well. So you'll find this along roadsides, and you'll also find it in Don Gardner's prairie too. Finally, at the end of the season, you get these gentians down amongst the grasses like this. And there's 2 different species. This is in Belmont Prairie up in DuPage County. Here's the blue bottle gentian and the cream bottle gentian down here like this. And then whenever you see this one, well, those are 9s, but when you see this one, this is a 10. This is the downy sunflower like this. And you only find it in really super high quality prairies and high quality restorations. And you can't buy this. It takes about 12 years or so, 10 to 12 years for a plant to grow from seed to flowering. And then, of course, the grasses. Prairie is a grassland, but I haven't been mentioning grasses because there are all of these. We're much more interested usually in the forbs, or what are called forbs, the prairie wildflowers, than we are in the grasses. But of course, you have big blue stem Indian grass and little blue stem. When you go to a natural prairie, you see very little switchgrass. Switchgrass is often used, well, there's cultivars that you can buy and grow in your yard of switchgrass, and they're used a lot in some restorations. But if you go to a natural prairie, you're not going to see very much switchgrass. What you will see is this one, prairie drop seed, which is a 10. It doesn't grow from seed very well. If you just put it in a seed mix, there are exceptions to that. But at Don Gardner's prairie, for instance. But anyway, it is commonly cultivated. You can buy plants of this in a garden center, and it's a gorgeous, gorgeous grass. This prairie drop seed. I have to tell one story. All plants have stories, but this has an ecological context to this. This is Desmodium or Illinois trick trefoil, which is a legume. And when you go to a woods, if you're a birder and you're looking for the migrating songbirds and things like that, woods are good places because there are a lot of plants that have fleshy fruits, both when birds are migrating north and they're migrating south. They rely on these fleshy fruits. And then also, if you walk through a woodland and you're wearing a nice stretchy pair of pants or a sweater or something like that, you're going to come out with fruit stuck to you. Well, in a prairie, there aren't fleshy fruited plants. I mean, there's strawberries down in the understory, maybe blackberries or something, but you don't have fleshy fruited plants. And also, you can walk through a prairie in your best sweater, and most of the time, you're going to come out with anything stuck to it because they don't have this kind of dispersal mechanism where they attach fruits to the fur of a passing animal like that, except for this one. And this one it has these beautiful pink flowers like this, and it has these fruits, the flowers develop into fruits. And this is what the fruits look like. And inside of each of those little segments is a seed, and these break apart. At those segments will break apart. And if you look up closely at this edge, they have all of these little hooks on them. And this is what those hooks look like under a scanning electron microscope like that. We had one at the National Survey. At the National Survey, we had a scanning electron microscope that we used like this. Well, it reminded me of Velcro is what it looks like, or like Velcro like this. But these are the hooks that if you're just passing by, or if you go to a prairie and you're wearing shorts, well, you might come out with these stuck to you, but Don Gardner really has decided not to put much of this in his prairie. And most of the native prairies, you don't really encounter many plants to stick to you, but there are other kinds of species, like in a woodland, where the plants stick to you. Well, prairie plants are gorgeous. They're beautiful. They're herbaceous perennial plants. They do well in cultivation, and we use them a lot in landscaping, but that's another talk entirely. And I'm sure if you have a space to grow plants, very likely you're going to be growing prairie plants. And if we go to where later on in my talk, where I've asked for questions and things, you'll see behind me, you'll see a bunch of prairie plants that I've collected from my yard this afternoon to bring in just as a backdrop behind. Well, European settlement. The first settlers that came to Illinois and to the Prairie region came from the forested regions of Eastern North America, who came in turn from forested regions in Europe. And so they were used to the forested regions. And as they came out onto the grasslands, they still followed along the rivers. They needed water to you need water to live. They also needed wood to build their houses with and to cook with and to heat with. And so they really needed wood. And so they tended to settle along the river streams. And they slowly moved out onto the open prairie. And there's an artist, Harvey Dunn, a series of nice prairie pictures. We would call these like just settlers, or they would go out. All they were doing is living there. They were not farmers. They just grew enough crops for their own use and maybe sell a small amount of grain to get by glass for the windows in the house or something like that, and collecting spring wildflowers. But they brought with them the plows they used to cut forest soil in Europe and in Eastern North America. And a team of oxen really could only cut an acre maybe in a day or something like that, very, very slow. Until a guy named John Deere in Grand Echo, Illinois, took a Sheffield steel saw blade from England and made the first self-scouring steel-bladed plow in 1837. And this revolutionized farming in the Prairie region. At the same period of time, people were, the Erie Canal opened up and the Illinois-Michigan Canal opened up, and they built the first railway from Chicago to Galena. And so you had railroads and you had boats coming in. It was possible for large numbers of people to come out onto the prairie and settle. And in a really short period of time, people went from being pioneer settlers out on the prairie, having maybe a garden or something like this, to organized agriculture like this that you see here, with a railroad going through to take goods, to, grain and cattle to market and things like this. In a very short period of time, this happened. This is an area, most of it's now covered, is southwest of Springfield and covered by Lake Springfield. But, sorry, there. But this is an area, it's from a book called Sugar Creek, Life on the Illinois Prairie. This was in 1838, this map is, and this is white as prairie. The forest is this area like that, and then along the riverfront, each big square, that's a square mile, and the little squares are houses, and just a little road coming through there, and the creeks and the streams of Sugar Creek going through there. And most all of this was open prairie. Just 20 years later, in 1858, look what's happened. All of the prairie has been plowed. There are lots of houses, probably more houses in those square miles than there are today in those agricultural areas. A railroad came through and a road came through like that. And so in that 20 years, almost all of that prairie was converted to agriculture. So what is left on the prairie today? Large urban areas like Chicago, taken from Navy Pier there, and agriculture, corn and soybeans dominate our landscape in Illinois today. So what does remain today? Well, originally there were about 21 million acres of prairie in Illinois, about 14 million acres of forest. And today, well, there was an Illinois Natural Areas Inventory was done in the 1980s and has been updated at least partially. And this figure has grown, maybe changed a bit, only really about 2,300 acres, more or less, remains of what we would call high quality prairie in the date given of 1980, like that. And that 2,300 acres is 1/100th of 1% of the original prairie is left. And so here in Peoria, you originally had about 208,700 acres of prairie in Peoria County. Only about 14 acres of that is left like that. Some of that is the Robertson Hill prairies that I've mentioned. I live in Champaign County. We had almost 600,000 acres of prairie. 1 acre is left today. A little Pioneer Cemetery in northeastern Champaign County, way up here like that, which was largely which was really brought back. The prairie was brought back. It's really a savanna, but brought back by one person who just went out there every day for many years to bring that back like that. It's interesting. You look up at Cook County, 521,000 acres. There's 391 acres left, and it's amazing how many prairies are still left in the Chicago area. And Lake County, 670, nearly all of that is sand prairie at Illinois Beach State Park. So where are these prairies that are left today? One of them, many of these are pioneer cemeteries, such as Prospect Cemetery Prairie. And there's a book, it's long out of print, but maybe it's still available on Amazon, or something called Butterfly Count. And by the author of the book is Sneed Collard III. But this guy, Paul Crater, was the artist. And he emailed me a series of times. This has been 15 or more, 20 years ago. And he had the contract to do the illustrations for this book. So I sent him pictures and slides, and he finally convinced the publisher to fly him into Chicago, and he rented a car, and I met him in Paxton, and we went to Paxton Cemetery Parade. It's wonderful just to look at this book, and you see these illustrations that were in the book, and it's this prairie right there. It's just unmistakably this prairie that you see there. And the other place that you find railroad remnants, and some of them are nature preserves. This happens to be where a railroad was a wide point as it went under an underpass, as a state road went under the underpass and left this prairie behind. And this is Don Gardner's site in Ford County. And this is the old railroad cut through here. And Don, in 10 years, 9 years ago, 10 years ago, Don was in his late 70s by then, and I get this email from Don. He says, I may be too old for this, but I just bought another 128 acres today. And so it was along this area south of the house where he was raised. His family never owned this. He cut all the trees on his side of this railroad embankment, has burned it for 9 years now. And it's just gorgeous. It has come back to this beautiful, beautiful prairie that was still there as a railroad remnant like that. Well, because Illinois has so little nature left, we've become a leader in preserving what we do have left. And the guy there with the orange, that is George Fell. And George Fell went to Washington, D.C. in the 50s, and as a representative for an offspring of the Ecological Society of America, as a lobbyist. And while he was in Washington, he helped found, along with some people from the University of Illinois and others, an organization that became known as the Nature Conservancy. And so George was very much involved with the founding of the Nature Conservancy. He eventually moved back. He was raised in Rockford, moved back to Rockford, and drafted really the astounding legislation, if you look at it today, establishing the Illinois Nature Preserve Commission in 1963. And the governor signing a declaration for the first set of nature preserves in Illinois. And your Broomfield Prairie is a dedicated Illinois nature preserve. And this goes on when something is made in an official nature preserve, it goes on the title, the deed of the land. And that land cannot be used for anything other than preserving nature on that land. And so it's important to preserve through the nature preserve system and other systems and counties and cities and states, but preserve those natural prairies and natural areas that still do remain today. But also because so little prairie remains, there's been a lot of interest in prairie restoration. This really started at the University of Wisconsin Arboretum back on the Civil Conservation Corps in 1935 and in 1941, where they started restoring prairie to former agricultural land. And this is really sort of the first example of really trying to restore an ecosystem that had been destroyed, utterly destroyed. It's really the first attempt with prairie to reconstruct an ecosystem. And so there's a lot of interest in prairie restoration today. And most of these are really recreations because you're doing it on agricultural land that had one time been prairie. There are several large programs. The federal government has a program, the Conservation Reserve Program, CRP. And as part of that, they have a pollinator habitat initiative. Many cities, counties, state parks, government agencies, as well as the federal, they also plant prairie. So most of these kinds of prairies that are planted have low species diversity, maybe 20 to 30 or maybe 40 species. The dominant plants are what are called workhorse species, which are early successional species having low coefficients of conservatism, and also their seed is cheap. All of these, when you go to these prairies, they don't have as much diversity as your natural prairie, but it's a start. But because of these large scale programs, there's been a whole native plant industry in the upper Midwest. And there's a grad student here at the University of Illinois currently that's been studying seed production areas and all sorts of things relating to availability of native plant species in the native plant industry. And in this upper Midwest, about 40% of all native plant species are available in some form or another from specialty nurseries, special nurseries of one kind or another. But almost 3/4 of all prairie plant species are available if you look hard enough and the right sources. Some very large companies in Illinois and in Indiana especially, and in Minnesota as well as other states as well. But there's a lot of species are available. But in addition to these large scale prairie restorations of these lower quality prairies, there are special people, usually individuals, that are growing prairie restorations. And when you look at a really good prairie, this is Don Gardner's a restoration, but the same applies if you look at a really high quality natural prairie. You're going to find greater structural complexity. This is that grass student. He came with the idea of this is you find vertical heterogeneity because you find little species grow, small species growing into that and mixing with these robust ones up here. But also you have not only vertical heterogeneity, you have a large species diversity within these high quality prairies, and you have species with these high coefficients of conservatism. And there are a number of these really high quality prairies around. This happens to be one at the College of DuPage Prairie in DuPage County. And this is just a small section of the Schulenburg Prairie at the Morton Arboretum. Both of these are showing the abundance of prairie drop seed in there like that. But some of these prairie restorations will have as many as 120 or more species in these prairie restorations. And you have the goal if you're Brimfield Prairie, Railroad Prairie, you're trying to get 100 species or more that are there, and including some with these high coefficients of conservatism, including like Queen of the Prairie that you have there. And then you have a few prairies that are these dedicated individuals, and these dedicated individuals like Don Gardner here. He has Don has 160 species in his prairie, and this is the original 7-acre field going up to about here, and he's had as an additional 8 acres of called the East Prairie that is back there. And I'm just going to close with a few pictures of Don's prairie, because this is kind of if you're doing prairie restoration and you want to restore not just the species, but a whole ecosystem and the ecological processes that go into making up a prairie, you want to emulate something like what has happened here or at the Schulenburg Prairie, Doris Westwell Prairie, and Danville and Vermilion County, and others like this, where you have species diversity, you have genetic diversity, you have high coefficients of conservatism all in one area. So this is just through the seasons at Don's like this, and he has not only well, let me back up here. You look at the genetic diversity here. He has from really deep magenta ones to almost pure white of the shooting stars that you see there like that, because they came from a variety of different sources. You have the prairie phlox like this, but you also have the white forms of that prairie phlox that are there. There is wild different species of mountain mint, and some of them have and also of Culver's root, and not only the ordinary Culver's root, but you have the ones with the silvery leaves on the backside like this. 4 species or 3 major species of silphiums there, not just one. Well, there's just one you see there like that, but I think you can see how many individuals of a species are there. It's like that, and this with milkweed, and then here's a little bit later in the year with more blazing stars coming through, and Culver's root, and all kinds of things that are coming in there. And then later in the fall, and here is this prairie gentian that is there, if not by the hundreds, well, it's hundreds, maybe thousands of the prairie gentians that are found in Don's Prairie as well. But it's through the combination of preserving these natural cemetery prairies or the other natural prairies that we see along with these high quality prairie restorations that we will have prairie for future generations. So that's my talk. And if you do want to, or that's my granddaughters, they may be watching tonight. So hello. Anyway, if you do have some questions and you want to get in touch with me, you can get in touch with me. There's my email address. And if some of you would like to see Don Gardner's Prairie, I go up there frequently, and it's not something, he likes groups to come in, not just people to wander around when he is not there. So if you would like to go, he may be, I think he is participating tonight. But either let Don know or me, and I know I go up fairly often and usually help Don with tours, the groups that come through. I know Will County Audubon came down a few years ago, and I haven't shown you any birds, but there are many, many species of birds at Don's Prairie. He has a list of species of birds on the prairie that was compiled by a local middle school teacher who's a great naturalist as well. So anyway, that is my talk.
Okay.
What do I, okay.
There's a large number of questions that came in. I'm just going to go ahead and read some of the questions off to you now. The first question was, is the Rivas Hill Prairie in Mason County open to the public? I am interested in visiting sometime.
Which prairie?
The Rivas Hill Prairie in Mason County.
Rivas Hill Prairie is open to the public, and Rivas is a beautiful, gorgeous place. There is it's owned by the state. It's a nature preserve. Don Gardner, as you see there, but he's a retired dentist. He practiced dentistry in Mason City, and he was at Rivas way before it was a dedicated nature preserve and all of that. And one of the owners was a patient of his. But anyway, Rivas Hill Prairie is open to the public, and it is. I want to get back to that one. It is open to the public. There is it's fairly near the town of Easton, and there is if you just search for Nature Preserve Directory, Illinois, you will come up to a DNR webpage of Department of Natural Resources, and there's a directory of nature preserves, and there are directions there. There is a parking lot for Rivas Hill Prairie. But I really like to go to the eastern end. There's a farmhouse and a barn, and farmhouses on the north, barns on the south. I like to go just past that house and park. And then this is a Loess Hill Prairie, and there's a big mound, a big Loess cliff there. And I like to go up just to the east of that cliff. And you come out into that spur that I was showing you that's really magnificent. So yes, I encourage you to go to Rivas.
Okay. When you was discussing the various abilities of legumes to add nitrogen compounds to the soil, the person asked, what makes a legume? Are legumes the only ones to take atmospheric nitrogen to convert it to ammonia as a fertilizer?
No, but in a practical sense, yes. In a prairie sense, yes. Well, I believe New Jersey tea does as well. I could be slightly mistaken on that, but New Jersey tea does as well. But there was a retired professor at the University of Illinois who studied these different kinds of plants, the whole range of plants that take atmospheric nitrogen and convert it to soil. But New Jersey tea, I'm almost sure, is one of them that does that as well. One thing that I didn't mention was that at Don's, but it also a really high quality prairie, you have what are called hemiparasites, which is like wood betony is a hemiparasite, and it has green leaves and flowers, and above ground you think it's a normal plant, but it doesn't have much of a root system of its own. It's a parasite that attaches to the roots of other plants, and I think that has been very good at keeping a lot of keeping the tall grasses under control at Don's, and keeping other species the balance. That when you have these hemiparasites in it, and I know there are people that one's a professor at Illinois State University that are studying the impacts of these hemiparasites. Toadflax is another one of these prairie plants that is a partial hemiparasite as well.
When you was discussing all of the conservation coefficients, a person asked, so should I seek to have Sullivan's milkweed for my garden instead of common milkweed?
No, and I'll tell you why. I have it in my garden, and it spreads underground, and it just comes up everywhere. It's actually very pretty, and I like it. And behind me, I have a bunch of prairie plants that I collected from my yard earlier today, but there's Sullivan's milkweed in there too. And it's nice. I've been told that it's not as good for monarchs as some other plants, like swamp milkweed is really good for monarchs, and common milkweed is good for monarchs as well. But in terms of a garden, I would not advise planting. That's one of them. I would not plant another. I have 4 silphiums in my yard, and but I do not have cup plant silphium, and cup plant silphium spreads too. And I just would not put that in a yard.
Well, in that line of discussion, one person made the comment that the problem with both of those plants is that they get very large, take up more space, and then can fall over. I believe that swamp milkweed is best for attracting monarch butterflies and for them to lay their eggs. So there was another person commented on the milkweed species.
Yes, well, one thing, when you're growing plants in your garden, native plants in your garden, prairie plants in particular, yes, if you go buy wild collected seed or something like that and you put it in a garden situation, they often do grow very vigorously and they fall over. Because in the natural prairie that you see, like the picture that's on the screen there right now, I mean, there's all of these plants growing together and they hold themselves up like that. And so, so I happen to have obedient plant in my yard or something like that. So, but I'm a purist when it comes to what kind of plants you put into a prairie restoration or a native prairie, where you're trying to recreate a native prairie, especially a high quality one. But I'm not that way when it comes to putting plants in my garden. I want things to look like they do in nature, but that means often planting or going to a garden center and buying something that's a cultivated variety. They call them nativars of some of the wild species. So some nativars are, say, good for pollinators, others not. So you have to be kind of careful with nativars, not to buy double flowered ones, for instance, or something like that. But they're derived from native species, but they're cultivated ones. So in a garden situation, I would, go to some garden centers, and some species you can grow from seed from the wild and they do okay, fine, others not. So anyway, okay, that's my view.
We also just had another person ask, why isn't gentian more common? And wondering if it's the soil conditions, lack of nurturing, or there are other environmental suppressions going on.
Gentian.
So repeat that about the gentian.
Yes, the gentian. Why isn't gentian more common?
Why isn't it more common? Oh, that's a good question, Scott. Well, it's like, why aren't most of these high plants with high coefficients of conservatism, why are they not common in places like that? The downy gentian, the one that's so rare that you really can't grow in cultivation, it isn't that. It requires, it's very sensitive to disturbance by man. I mean, or by grazing or by plowing or anything like any kind of a human disturbance. All of these things with a high coefficient of conservatism, they come out very quickly. Like if you lead plant is a legume like that, and it has a high coefficient of conservatism because any time you have it in there with cattle or grazing like that, they're going to eat it and it's going to go out very quickly like that. They simply do not tolerate human disturbance of one kind or another like that. And so you go to a high quality prairie, you do find gentians that are there by the hundreds or by the thousands. Don has 5 species of gentians in his particular prairie like that. Having said that, the cream gentian is pretty easy to grow. You can buy it in stores and some of the other bottle gentians as well, but it does tolerate a good bit of disturbance. It cannot stand much competition, however. I don't know if I've really answered Scott's question there or not, but they just don't like much human disturbance. But you go to an undisturbed prairie or one that's a high quality prairie, yeah, they're pretty common.
Yeah. We had a couple of compliments here. One person really appreciates the history of the Nature Conservancy and George Fell. It's a good reminder of many of the organizations that are out there helping to support conservation. Another person just asked, what makes a parasite as opposed to a good prairie plant?
A parasite. Okay, well, different plants have different strategies. on getting, staying alive in the world. These partial parasites, there are a whole group of these. I mean, there are true parasites like mistletoe. Well, no, mistletoe. I could give a whole lecture. I have a lecture on parasitic plants I give to a class here at U of I. There are true parasites like that have no chlorophyll at all and that derive all of their nutrition from being parasitic on another plant. Okay. And then there are plants like mistletoe, which is a shrub that grows in a tree. It's a shrub that's just parasitic totally on a host tree like that. So mistletoe is a parasite. Then you have things like these in a prairie, like the wood betony or the bastard toadflax, those things. Those are hemiparasites. Above ground, they don't look like they're parasitic, and they maybe can live a little bit on their own, but they really attach themselves to the roots of other plants, so they don't have to bother about growing and getting roots of other growing their own roots. But it's just a strategy that they have, and it works well. And especially in restoration, it works well. It seems to work. It's worked very well in Don, and there's other studies that are showing that having these hemiparasites in your in a prairie restoration helps. It's those shooting star, which is not a parasitic plant, but shooting star seed is thousands of dollars, and so is it's really very expensive to do. Brings up another point. I'll get to that in a minute. But the seeds of well, it's a very interesting dispersal mechanism in wood betony, the way the seeds are dispersed, but they're very tiny, they're difficult to collect, and they're very, very expensive. And they don't always come through. You can scratch them into a prairie, and sometimes they come through, they don't. I had a grad student 15 years ago or so that got a little tablespoon of seed from Don, and he scratched it into a really low quality prairie south of the University South farm, and it's taken off in there. That really took, and it's knocked back a lot of the big grasses and let other species spread in there like that. One thing about prairie restorations, there's many of these companies have seed mixes, and they have many different kinds of seed mixes. And these seed mixes for like the CRP land and things, they talk in terms of how many ounces of seed per acre, okay? How many ounces of seed of little blue stem or something you put in an acre in this seed mix in the rating. Don Gardner had buckets full, okay? He did it very slowly, and the Barton Arboretum Prairie, they worked, the seeds, everything was done by plugs and put in carefully by hand. And so places like Don, they harvest the seed and they start new areas or put it back on the same site. And you were like with Prairie Drop Seed, he had like 12 pounds of pure seed. And that's worth several $1,000s. And he put it on repeatedly over his prairie like that. And it's come through in places very nicely. Most places can't afford to do that. He has his own nursery to start his own, to have a supply of seed like that. So I've digressed, but maybe that's helpful, useful information.
Well, people are showing their appreciation in all of the comments coming in. So on behalf of the Peoria Audubon Society, we really appreciate your taking the time to talk with us with regards to prairies. And it's almost worth a reminder that the Peoria Audubon Society has taken ownership of a small 6-acre prairie near Brimfield, and you can actually look at it and get a map to it from the Peoria Audubon website, which is peoriaaudubon.org. And if you can't spell Audubon, Google does a really good job of actually directing you there. So we appreciate you taking the time to speak with us, and we thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed it. Thank you very much.